The chronometer inside the dead Ashvane biovault was still counting when Dr. Naomi Kade cracked it open, and for 3 full seconds, kneeling in the cold dark of a wreck that had been drifting unclaimed for a decade, she genuinely believed she was about to die. The pulse came first, a slow bioluminescent throb crawling up through the vault's ribbed interior wall like something breathing, and every instinct honed across 4 years of cataloging Ashvane wreckage screamed at her to seal her suit, retreat, and detonate the whole compartment from a safe distance the way protocol demanded. But protocol had never once, in a decade of studying humanity's supposedly defeated enemy, actually explained why a vessel destroyed at the Battle of Vega 10 years earlier still had a single functioning system aboard it, buried deep in a biovault her scanners insisted had been stone cold and inert for a decade. She reached out instead, gloved fingers hovering a centimeter above the pulsing membrane, and did the thing every safety briefing she'd ever sat through explicitly forbade. Oh, she touched him. The pulse didn't attack her. It responded, brightening in a rhythm that her suit's passive recorder immediately began logging as structured, deliberate, unmistakably a signal rather than a biological reflex. And Naomi Kade, alone in the gutted husk of a ship that had tried to end her species a decade earlier, felt the particular vertigo of a discovery too large to process standing up. "Kasha Station, this is Kade," she said into her suit comm, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need immediate retrieval support and full quarantine protocol on compartment 41 of the Vega wreck designated Site 9. I've found something active." The response took longer than it should have, the particular lag of a station crew that had grown over 10 years of routine salvage work, thoroughly unaccustomed to anything aboard the old battlefield actually surprising them. "Copy that, Dr. Kade. Say again, did you say active? Active how?" "Active as in still running," Naomi said, staring at the slow, patient pulse of light crawling across the biovault's inner wall, already recognizing, with a cold certainty she would spend the next several years trying and failing to make anyone else share, that whatever this was, it was not a malfunction. It was a countdowns. It took her research team 11 weeks to fully decode what she'd found. 11 weeks of painstaking cross-analysis between the recovered biosignal and every fragment of translated Ashvane physiology the Terran Deep Archive Institute had managed to compile since the war's official end. And when the final translation finally resolved into something coherent, Naomi sat alone in her office at 3 in the morning station time and read it 17 times before she trusted herself to believe it. The Ashvane Host did not simply retreat when defeated. It withdrew in a manner precisely analogous to the dormancy cycles observed in the species' own biological reproduction, into a state the fragmented archive translated, imperfectly but consistently across every recovered sample. As the blooms sleep, a period of extended hibernation tied not to arbitrary strategic timing, but to a fixed biological interval encoded with startling precision into the reproductive chemistry of every Ashvane vessel's crew. The biovault she'd found had not been counting down to some external military deadline. It had been counting down the way a seed counts down to spring, patiently, biologically, inevitably, toward the exact moment the host's next generation would reach maturity and rise, hungry and renewed, to resume the campaign the previous generation had been forced to abandon. According to her translation, and to the 4 independent verification passes she demanded from colleagues before she allowed herself to fully trust the result, that moment was scheduled to arrive in 9 years, 143 days from the date she'd cracked open that dead ship's biovault. Battle of Vega had not ended the war. It had only ever paused it, on a clock the Ashvane themselves had built into their own biology long before any human had ever heard the species' name, and nobody outside a handful of increasingly alarmed researchers on Kasha Station had the faintest idea the clock was still running. The Terran Council's demobilization committee received her preliminary report 4 months after the discovery, submitted through every proper channel, cross-verified, peer-reviewed, and supported by physical evidence recovered directly from Ashvane wreckage. Councillor Petra Lindqvist, who chaired the committee and had built her entire post-war political career on the popular, deeply held conviction that humanity's victory at Vega represented a genuine, permanent end to 4 brutal decades of conflict, read the report in a closed session that lasted, by Naomi's later count, exactly 40 minutes before the committee's official response arrived. Insufficient corroborating evidence to justify revision of current demobilization timeline. Recommend continued monitoring at existing research budget levels. They read 4 months of decoded biological data, Naomi said, standing in Admiral Dorian Achebe's small office aboard Kasha Station. The printed committee response crumpled in one fist. And their response is to keep my budget exactly where it was before I found evidence that the war we just spent a decade celebrating the end of is going to restart itself automatically in less than 9 years. Achebe, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s whose steel-gray hair and the old burns scarring along his jaw were the only visible remnants of a career that had included personal command of the Human Coalition's flagship during the final hours of the Battle of Vega, listened to her with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 30 years learning not to react to bad news until he'd fully understood its shape. "You have to understand the position you're putting them in, Naomi," he said finally. "I was there. I watched 40,000 people die driving that fleet out of this system. I signed the surrender documentation myself for whatever that was worth against a species that apparently never actually intended it to be permanent. And I understand exactly why what you found terrifies me." But Lindqvist and the rest of that committee were elected on a platform of peace, built on the genuine, desperately needed relief an entire traumatized species felt when the fighting finally stopped. You're asking them to tell that same species less than a decade later that the fighting never actually stopped at all. That's not just a difficult political position, Naomi. It's an almost impossible one. "So what?" Naomi said. "We just let the clock run out in silence because the truth is politically inconvenient." "No," Achebe said, and something in his voice hardened into the quiet, immovable resolve she would come to recognize over the following years, as the closest thing to a promise the old Admiral ever made. "We prepare anyway, quietly. Without their budget, without their public backing, using whatever resources people who still remember what Vega actually cost are willing to contribute without asking permission from a committee that's decided the truth isn't worth funding." What followed over the next several years was not the dramatic, headline-grabbing struggle Naomi had half expected when she first cracked open that dead biovault. It was slower than that, quieter, and in its own way far more exhausting. A patient, careful campaign waged almost entirely outside official channels, built on personal relationships, retired military favors, and the stubborn, unglamorous persistence of people who had decided, independently and without coordination at first, that the cost of being wrong about Naomi's research was simply too catastrophic to risk ignoring. Achebe quietly reactivated old contacts across the demobilized fleet's officer corps, men and women who had fought at Vega and, unlike much of the wider public, had never entirely allowed themselves to believe the peace was as simple as the official narrative insisted. Naomi expanded her small research team, one careful recruitment at a time, drawing in linguists, biologists, and tactical analysts who reviewed her data independently and came away, almost without exception, converted from skeptics into quiet, determined allies. And across a dozen systems along the old wartime frontier, a slow, deliberate program of infrastructure hardening began, disguised in official records as routine maintenance and disaster preparedness upgrades. Funded through budget lines too small and too boring to attract political scrutiny, each individually modest improvement contributing, year after year, to a defensive readiness that the Terran Council's official demobilization policy had explicitly abandoned. It was not enough, and everyone involved knew it. Naomi's countdown, refined further with each additional Ashvane sample her team managed to recover and translate, held stubbornly consistent at just over 9 years from her initial discovery. And 9 years, she understood with growing dread as the work continued, was simply not enough time to rebuild, even quietly, even with Achebe's considerable remaining influence. Anything close to the coalition fleet strength that had barely, at ruinous cost, achieved victory the first time. "We need the Ilthrin," she told Achebe, 4 years into the effort, the two of them reviewing readiness projections in the same small station office where their partnership had first begun. "And the other coalition members. We can't do this alone, Dorian. Even everything we've managed to build in secret isn't close to enough. You want to tell an entire coalition of allied species that the war they believe humanity ended on their behalf is actually still coup." "Ending down," Achebe said. "Based on evidence, a majority of our own government has officially dismissed as insufficient." "I want to tell them the truth," Naomi said, "before it's too late to matter. I'd rather be humiliated in front of the entire coalition for being wrong than be right and silent while an unprepared galaxy gets caught the same way we did the first time." If Naomi Kade's quiet 9-year fight to make anyone listen is pulling you in the way it pulled in her small, stubborn team of allies, go ahead and hit like on the video. Subscribe if you want more slow-burn HFY stories about the people who keep watch when everyone else has decided it's safe to stop. And tell me in the comments whether you think the Ilthrin and the rest of the coalition are going to believe her in time, because what happens next changes everything about how this war actually ends. The Ilthrin Assembly. When Naomi and Achebe finally secured an audience through channels that bypassed the Terran Council entirely, an act that would later cost Achebe formally, though he never once expressed regret about it, proved considerably more receptive than either of them had dared hope. The Ilthrin, an avian-descended species whose own homeworld had suffered 2 direct Ashvane assaults during the war's middle decades, possessed institutional memory and cultural instincts that made Naomi's warning land very differently than it had among a human public eager, above almost everything else, to finally stop being afraid. "We have old stories," said Assembly Speaker Corvi Thess, an elder Ilthrin diplomat whose feathered crest had gone almost entirely silver with age, listening to Naomi's full presentation in a formal chamber built, unlike most human meeting spaces, with windows open to actual sky rather than sealed against vacuum. "From before we ever encountered your species, before the Ashvane first came to our worlds at all, stories about a hunger that returns. We always assumed they were metaphor. Cultural memory of some ancient, forgotten predator, nothing more." She studied the translated data Naomi's team had prepared with obvious, unhurried care. "Dr. Kade, I believe your countdown may simply be the first time anyone has ever managed to put a precise number on what our oldest stories always warned us was inevitable." The Ilthrin Assembly's formal commitment of resources, modest at first but expanding steadily as Naomi's continued research provided ever more granular confirmation of the Ashvane Bloom sleep cycle, gave the quiet, unofficial coalition defense effort something it had desperately lacked: legitimacy beyond a single stubborn admiral and a scientist the Terran Council had officially, repeatedly dismissed. Other coalition members followed more slowly, some driven by genuine conviction after reviewing the accumulating evidence, others by a more cynical, pragmatic calculation that even a small chance of Naomi being right justified modest, quiet preparation against catastrophic downside risk. The Terran Council itself remained the last, most stubborn holdout, and Councillor Lindqvist's public position hardened rather than softened as Naomi's warnings gained traction among the wider coalition. A political reality Naomi came to understand, with painful clarity, had less to do with the actual strength of the evidence, and everything to do with the impossible cost of admitting publicly that the peace an entire traumatized generation had built their recovery around might never have been real at all. "I know you believe what you're telling me," Lindqvist said, In the single formal meeting the two women ever had directly, 5 years into Naomi's campaign, the counselor's office a study in careful, deliberate calm that Naomi suspected had been cultivated specifically to withstand exactly this kind of confrontation. I've read every report your team has produced. I don't doubt your competence, Dr. Kade, or your sincerity. But you have to understand what you're asking this government to do. You're asking us to tell an entire species, still barely recovering from 40 years of continuous warfare, that the 4 remaining years of peace they believe they've earned are actually the final years of a ceasefire nobody ever agreed to. Do you have any conception of what that would do to the fragile stability we've spent a decade rebuilding? I have a conception of what it will do if the Ashvane return exactly on schedule and find us exactly as unprepared as we are right now because your committee decided the truth was too destabilizing to share, Naomi said. Counselor, I'm not asking you to declare martial law. I'm asking you to fund defensive preparation at a fraction of wartime levels. Quietly, gradually, in a way that doesn't have to shatter anyone's peace of mind before it's necessary. I'm asking for the same thing Admiral Achebe and I have already been doing without your help for 5 years. I'm just asking you to finally let us so it properly before we run out of time to matters. Lindqvist studied her for a long, silent moment, and something in her careful composure cracked, just slightly, revealing underneath it something that looked, to Naomi's surprise, less like stubborn denial and more like genuine, exhausted fear. If I authorize what you're asking for, Lindqvist said quietly, and you're wrong, I will have spent political capital that took a decade to build convincing an entire species to relive its worst trauma for nothing. And if I don't authorize it and you're right, I will have doomed however many people die in the opening days of a war we could have been ready for. She shook her head. There is no version of this decision where I get to be simply, comfortably correct, Dr. Kade. I imagine that's a feeling you understand better than almost anyone alive right now. She authorized a modest increase in Naomi's research funding that day, and nothing more, and Naomi left that meeting understanding, with a clarity that settled into her chest like a stone, that the full weight of what remained to be done would continue falling, as it had for 5 years already, on the shoulders of people willing to act without waiting for official permission to be afraid of the right thing. The final 2 years of the countdown passed in a blur of accelerating, increasingly desperate preparation. Achebe's quiet network of veteran officers, expanded now with genuine, if still officially unsanctioned, Ilthran military cooperation, worked to harden key defensive positions along the old wartime frontier. Positions that Naomi's continued research suggested, based on patterns in the recovered Ashvane biological data, would likely see the earliest concentration of the host's renewed assault. Naomi herself spent those final years dividing her time between the increasingly precise refinement of her countdown, narrowing steadily from a window of months down to a matter of days, and an exhausting, continuous campaign to convince every coalition government still on the fence that the evidence, by now overwhelming, justified action before it was too late to matter. Councillor Lindqvist's position shifted, finally, decisively, 14 months before the countdown's projected end, not because of any single piece of new evidence, but because of an event that Naomi would later describe in the careful historical accounts written after everything that followed, as the moment denial simply became more frightening than the truth it had been protecting. A small Ashvane scout vessel, precisely the kind of early-stage reconnaissance signature Naomi's models predicted would begin appearing as the Bloom Sleep's final phase approached, was detected and destroyed by a routine coalition patrol along the frontier, its wreckage recovered largely intact for the first time since the war's official end. The biological samples pulled from that wreck confirmed, beyond any remaining scientific doubt, everything Naomi's team had been warning about for 6 years. Active, awakening Ashvane physiology precisely matched to the maturation timeline her original countdown had calculated. Lindqvist called an emergency session of the full Terran Council within hours of receiving the confirmed lab results, and Naomi Kade, invited for the first time to address the assembled government directly rather than through the narrow, dismissive channel of the Demobilization Committee, stood before the full weight of human political leadership and delivered, in the plainest language she could manage, 6 years of careful, patient, relentlessly verified truth. "I understand what I'm asking," she told them, standing in a chamber that had, a decade earlier, formally ratified the ceasefire everyone had believed ended the war for good. "I'm asking you to tell an entire species that the peace it fought so hard to earn was only ever a pause. I've spent 6 years understanding exactly how much that costs, because I've watched Admiral Achebe and a small, exhausted coalition of allies pay that cost quietly on their own because your predecessors decided the truth wasn't worth the political price of admitting. I am done asking you to believe me on faith. The wreckage in that lab isn't faith. It's 14 months at most before the Ashvane Host returns to finish what it started at Vega. And I would very much like this government to finally spend those 14 months preparing instead of arguing about whether the clock is real." The vote that followed passed with a majority Naomi hadn't dared hope for, and the 14 months that followed became the most intense, most consequential period of coordinated coalition military preparation since the war's darkest years. A full mobilization conducted this time not in the chaos of surprise, but with the hard-won advantage of 6 years' worth of quiet, careful groundwork laid by people who had refused to wait for permission to take the threat seriously. I'll tell you later. Ashvane Host returned to the edge of coalition space on the exact day Naomi Kade's original countdown, first decoded from a dead ship's pulsing biovault 7 years earlier, predicted it would, arriving not in the overwhelming, unstoppable force that had nearly broken humanity the first time, but into a defensive network built, hardened, and coordinated across an entire coalition of species who had spent 14 months, and in the case of humanity's quiet inner circle, 7 full years preparing for exactly this moment. The battle that followed, fought primarily along the same old frontier positions Achebe's network had spent years reinforcing, lasted 11 days, brutal and costly in ways that no amount of preparation could have fully prevented, but decisive in a manner that the original Battle of Vega, for all its desperate heroism, had never actually achieved. The coalition fleet, forewarned and prepared, did not simply drive the returning host into retreat. They broke its capacity to wage sustained war entirely, striking the awakening Bloom's core reproductive vessels before the host could achieve the kind of overwhelming numerical advantage that had made the original war so devastatingly costly, ending in 11 days of hard, coordinated fighting, a threat that Naomi's research suggested, based on the full pattern now finally understood in its entirety, might otherwise have continued returning in cycles for generations to come. Admiral Achebe did not survive the battle's 4th day, killed aboard the same flagship he had commanded a decade earlier at Vega. Holding a defensive line along the frontier his own quiet network had spent 7 years fortifying. Naomi received the news in the same small research office where their partnership had begun, and sat with it, alone, for a long time before she found the strength to keep working. Because the battle was not yet finished and the coalition's coordination depended, in its final critical days, on data only her team could still provide. She thought sitting there about the first thing he had ever told her in that same office 7 years earlier. We prepare anyway, quietly, without their budget, without their public backing. He had kept that promise for 7 years, through political dismissal and quiet, unglamorous sacrifice that history, until the final months, had never once acknowledged. And in the end, his patient, stubborn refusal to accept a comfortable peace built on denial had bought exactly the margin of readiness that turned an 11-day battle into a decisive coalition victory instead of a second catastrophe. The formal ceremony marking the war's second, and this time genuinely final, conclusion took place 8 months after the battle's end, in the same chamber where Naomi had once stood alone, 7 years earlier, trying to convince a skeptical government that a dead ship's still pulsing chronometer represented anything more than an anomaly worth a modest research grant. Councillor Lindqvist, whose political career had been fundamentally reshaped by the decision to finally listen, presided over the ceremony. And when the time came for formal remarks, she insisted, over Naomi's own quiet objection, that the analyst who had spent nearly a decade counting days nobody else believed mattered be the one to speak first. 10 years ago, Naomi told the assembled coalition representatives, human and Ilthrin and a dozen other species who had, in the final desperate year, finally united behind evidence that had taken far too long to earn the attention it deserved. We celebrated the end of a war at Vega, and we were wrong not because we lacked courage or conviction, but because we didn't yet understand what we were actually fighting. I spent 7 years counting days that most of my own government insisted didn't matter, because the alternative, admitting the peace we'd fought so hard to build was only ever temporary, was simply too painful to accept. I understand that pain. I've never once blamed anyone for wanting so badly to believe the fighting was finally, permanently over. She paused, thinking of Achebe, of 7 years of quiet, uncelebrated sacrifice that had finally, at devastating cost, been vindicated. But I've learned something in the past decade that I think matters more than any single battle, won or lost. Peace isn't something you win once and then get to stop thinking about. It's something you have to keep choosing to protect, carefully, honestly, even when the truth is inconvenient, even when counting the days feels like giving up on the hope that they might never run out. We finally won this war together, not because we stopped being afraid. We won it because enough of us were willing to keep watching, quietly, patiently, long after everyone else had decided it was safe to look away. The applause that followed was quieter than victory celebrations usually were, tempered by the genuine, hard-won understanding of exactly what the past decade had cost, but it carried underneath its restraint something Naomi recognized as more durable than simple triumph. The sound of an entire coalition of species finally, collectively choosing to stop pretending that peace was a destination rather than a discipline, something built and rebuilt patiently every single day by people willing to keep counting long after everyone else believed the counting was finally done. Naomi Kade returned to Kasha Station 3 months later, back to the same small research post where a decade earlier she had cracked open a dead ship's pulsing biovault and found a truth nobody wanted to hear. The wreckage field around the station looked different now, quieter, genuinely settled in a way it never quite had during the 10 years she'd spent watching it with the particular vigilance of someone who understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how much silence could hide. She kept in her office a small preserved fragment of that original biovault chronometer, its pulse long since gone dark and permanently still. And she looked at it sometimes, not out of fear anymore, but as a quiet, private reminder of the discipline that had carried her and everyone beside her through the longest decade of her life. That the wars worth truly winning are rarely the ones that end in a single decisive battle, but the ones that end because someone somewhere was patient enough and brave enough to keep counting the days everyone else had already stopped believing mattered. The galaxy moved on slowly into a peace built this time on genuine vigilance instead of comfortable denial. And Naomi Kade, who had spent 7 years being told her countdown was insufficient evidence, found herself at last, simply and quietly, no longer counting anything at all.